Welcome to another episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show. Today, bringing you another really fascinating guest involved in creating a better tomorrow for many people out there. Today, we have the honor of being joined on the show by Dr. James Madara, who is the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Vice President of the American Medical Association, our country's largest physician organization, where since 2011, he has helped sculpt the organization's long-term strategic plan. He also serves as the chairman of Health 2047, which is a wholly owned innovation subsidiary of the AMA that was formed to help overcome systemic dysfunction in U.S. healthcare, and they're located in Silicon Valley, and they ultimately work to form and scale various transformative healthcare spinouts in areas like chronic care, data utility, as well as productivity and healthcare value. Dr. Madara also holds an academic title of adjunct professor of pathology at Northwestern. Prior to the AMA, Dr. Madara spent the first 22 years of his career at Harvard Medical School, both clinical and research training, serving as a tenured professor and as director of the NIH-sponsored Harvard Digestive Disease Center. And following 5 years as chair of pathology and lab medicine at Emory, moved on to become dean of both biology and medicine, and then became the CEO of the University of Chicago Medical Center. Extensively published, extensively awarded. Dr. Madara is also an elected member of both the American Society of Clinical Investigation and the Association of American Physicians, and he co-chairs the Value Incentives and Systems Action Collaborative National Academy of Medicine, as well as being a member of the National Academy's Leadership Consortium for the Value and Science-Driven Healthcare. A lot of really important and timely topics to get into today. Honored to have him with us. Dr. James Madara, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, no, great having you. A lot of themes to get into today. Would love to start off at the beginning, sort of going back to where I am right now in Philadelphia, which is not just where you went to medical school, but also where back in 1847, I think it was, the AMA was first formed around the corner at the National Academy of Sciences. Take us a little bit into your background story, if you would, for the audience, and what got you into medicine in the first place.
Well, actually, Philadelphia ends up playing a role, as you'll see. So I grew up in central Pennsylvania, a little town near Altoona, Pennsylvania. And my interest in medicine began when I was playing basketball in I think fifth grade, sixth grade at lunchtime, and discoordinated, running in for a layup and ran into the pool. And that night began having headaches. And my mother came in the middle of the night and noticed my eye was protruding. I ended up having something called a cavernous sinus thrombosis, which was a clot centrally in the brain. And the local ophthalmologist knew someone who was specialized in complicated things in Philadelphia. So they shipped me down. My father was a conductor in the Penn Central, so he took me on the train, and I got dropped off at Pennsylvania Hospital.
Yep.
There in Philadelphia, probably the oldest hospital in Philadelphia, is, and probably dating from the 18th century. And I think Benjamin Franklin was a founder of Pennsylvania Hospital. So I was there for several weeks, first in isolation, then in a children's ward. And my ophthalmologist, Edmund Spaeth, always would come in every day, and I would remember him from the odor of coffee mixed with his cologne, and he would be surrounded by, interns and residents and some medical students, and just got really interested in medicine through that experience. But Philadelphia played a role.
Absolutely. As did basketball, and I do walk by pretty much every day the old building where the statue of Ben Franklin's outside still. So yeah, I I appreciate the long history there as well. So no, I definitely appreciate that background. Jim, from the like the late 1970s towards the 2000s, you build up a rather extensive sort of bibliography in this area of what would broadly define as intestinal epithelial pathobiology, where I look at it as a before we even use the term sort of systems biology, before the omics era, really looking at everything that had to do with the gut, the intestinal system, from a systems biology approach. And I would love if you could just talk a little bit, because you brought up everything from areas that are quite hot nowadays, from how the microbiome affects the drugs we take. You were involved in some really early cancer vaccine work at Harvard before immuno-oncology was, it took a couple decades later before immuno-oncology even became a thing. What got you into intestinal epithelial pathobiology? Because I think this is another really important piece of your early career that I want to touch on.
Well, when I left Philadelphia, left medical school, I was interested in radiation oncology.
Right.
Um, but I felt that I didn't know enough about pathology to really start an oncology career. And so asked to do some pathology and ended up in the Harvard system doing surgical pathology, and ran into a person who I really liked, was a ideal mentor, a fellow named Roger Haggett, and his specialty was GI pathology. So my personal relationship with Roger led me toward GI pathology, and staring down a microscope at intestinal epithelial cells all day long starts making you wonder what those things are doing. Um, and so that got me interested in doing a more of a research kind of exposure, which I did at the medical school there in cell and molecular biology, and started my own lab then at in epithelial cell biology. And we're just asking basic questions. There are huge volumes of fluids and other substances and nutrients that cross that epithelium all the time.
Yep.
How does that work as a barrier, to let some things across and not others? And that led us to start looking at these junctions between epithelial cells. And they're kind of like the plastic on a six-pack of Coke, surrounding each can and
Hmm.
separating the space above the cans from the space around the cans. And they were thought to be impermeable seals. But then they turned out, we recognized through our work, they were actually pretty permeable, but they were selective to small molecules. And then they were also regulated, it turned out, so that when the epithelial cell would take, say, salts, electrolytes across the surface, the top surface, and deposit them in the space between the cans, under this seal, it would create a solute gradient that would then drive water movement and some solvent drag through the paracellular space and amplify the ability of this whole epithelium to absorb a lot. Uh, and then other questions were, the intestine is really great at digesting and absorbing. So why
Yep.
doesn't it digest itself? Um, and the answer there is it largely does. It's just the surface turns over so rapidly.
Yep.
It's a constantly repairing. Uh, every day you have a new lining to your intestine, which is like a double tennis court being renewed, once a day.
Yep.
Uh, so that was an interesting biological feature. I would say a third was the work that was being done on inflammation at the time in the intestine was around why does say an inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's
Mm.
disease, ulcerative colitis, why does inflammation occur? And we flipped that question, which was given the content of the intestine, how is it possible that inflammation isn't always occurring? Um, and that began a study of looking at how bacteria, prokaryotes, interacted with epithelial cells, eukaryotes, which was a new field at the time. Now we talk about the microbiome, the interactions all the time. But at that time, it was thought that bacteria were, you know, would be harmful under certain circumstances and they would somehow kill epithelial cells. Um, and what we learned was that non-pathogens that were bacteria and some subspecies of these bacteria had what were called type 3 secretory apparati.
Hmm.
And if you look at them under an electron microscope with negative staining, they look like a little syringe with an injector. And they inject inside the epithelial cells uh, proteins, bacterial derived proteins that end up interfering with signaling pathways, including inflammatory signaling pathways in the epithelium. So there's this sort of subtle dance. It was also recognized that if you take bacteria away from the gut completely uh, and you look at the gut development, it doesn't develop very well.
Yeah.
That there's a role for the bacteria in signaling, the maturation of the surface of these epithelial cells that allow digestion and absorption to occur. So it was really a fascinating study. I have to say there was a meeting in the Swiss Alps put on jointly by the American Society of Cell Biology and the European Molecular Biology Association. And they wanted to look at this was in the 80s. They wanted to look at bacteria and epithelial cells, human epithelial cells coming together. And it was up in the mountains. And most of, the original work on the microbiome and these kinds of studies, you can trace back the investigators to being present at that meeting.
Mm.
Uh, and I remember being up in the mountains and the eukaryotic, human epithelial, the human epithelial cell people would present, and the microbiologists would sit there wondering, why would anyone even want to study anything so complicated? And then the microbiologists would present, and they would have at that time, very forward-looking genetic manipulation of bacteria. And we would look at each other and say, how is it possible they can do those wonderful things? Um, and one of the things I learned from that meeting is that different fields have different language,
Right.
and you have to have multiple shots at that, understanding across that barrier. And if the meeting was probably 4 days and wasn't a lot of people, probably 70 people, something like that. And, you could have a conversation across that language barrier at lunch with someone, excuse me, um, process that and recognize that the questions you really wanted to ask, you hadn't asked.
Yeah.
So put them at another lunch or a dinner. And it was really remarkable. On a personal level, it was remarkable for another reason, and that is my family, right before my family had just been vacationing in Nantucket. Uh, and the airport was closed in. So I had to get to the Boston airport to make this flight to Europe. And we had been crabbing that morning and just decided, I would have to go back to our house in Boston and change, pick up my slides, rush to the airport. That didn't work out so well, so I was unable to change. I had my same clothes. I was covered with crab juice on this flight to Europe, and I thought, well, I'll get more clothes when I get to the site. But the site was in just a remote hotel in the Swiss Alps.
Oof.
So I was burdened by, washing things in the sink from getting crab juice off of me in the first things of that meeting. But it was a great meeting.
No, again, it's a rather elegant set of research, and as I was saying, it's all very hot themes, whether we're talking about microbiome, the immune system, immune oncology, regeneration. So all very pertinent, and as we get later into discussing Health 2047 and innovation and how we properly balance care and innovation, I think it feeds nicely into some of what you're doing now. So I appreciate you laying that groundwork. Um, you take the reins at University of Chicago Medical Center in 2002 as CEO. And you publish a couple really interesting papers the next couple of years that I'd like to go into just because I think they set the stage for some of what we're going to be talking about per the AMA programs. One of them was in JAMA in November 2005, entitled The Role of the Urban Academic Medical Center in United States Healthcare. And in this paper, you say, look, we as the academic medical center, we have to train physicians, we have to do this research, we have to take care of patients of all types, the sickest, the most debilitated, those that lack financial capabilities, and there needs to be sort of a redefinition of the community, a part of the community academic medical center connection here, because there's not infinite resources, and sort of this redefining of what community care, community-based health care really means. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this paper and a little bit of some of the key learnings, because I think these are also, as we get close to 2025, kind of pertinent to what's going on in the U.S. healthcare system.
Yeah, thanks, Ira. I would I would unwind that paper a little bit now and then extend it as well. And unwinding it, I would say that the problem is how do you get a cost structure to provide health care that's matched to the patient's need? Um, and right now, if an institution has to do everything, you're dealing with like a store that has simultaneously Neiman Marcus and Ace Hardware.
Right.
And you have that mixed cost platform. The Neiman Marcus part might be the heart transplant, and the Ace Hardware might be the community-acquired pneumonia that just needs an IV drip of antibiotics for 2 or 3 days. And the cost structures are very different. So, what if you have a program that is a dressed up program for heart transplant? You need a volume to go through that to sustain the program. Anything in your local community, and it's irrelevant whether it's people have insurance or not, but anyone in the local community that needs that heart transplant, that's yours.
Right.
But that's probably not enough to make a robust program. So you have to think about, those programs servicing a larger population. The way I would extend it to now with subsequent learnings is that it's also a manifestation of how siloed our healthcare system is. That we don't have interoperability, across boundaries. And when at Chicago, there are a lot of things I learned. For example, if there were high quality, federally qualified health centers, local clinics and communities that folks could go to, if their disease required that, that's what they wanted. But if they got really sick, they wanted to have access, to the university. And in fact, if they weren't so sick, they'd prefer not to go to this place that was some distance away. It was like had, terrible transportation and, was congested. Um, and so creating that network of interaction between the university and the FQHCs was very instructive, and we found that that was, you know, a great way to do things. In fact, we even learned that if you did some of the quality measures for sort of bread and butter um, diabetes care,
Mhm.
some of those quality measures were actually better at the FQHC than in the university hospital. Uh, and it had to do with the university hospital being prepared for 1,000 things, not a few. Uh, and so, this disruption that we have in our health system by having all of these silos that don't interact, make this problem of how do we best use those platforms. And I think one of the biggest lesions in healthcare in the United States right now is this lack of continuity of care
Mhm.
afforded by this separation and siloing of these various healthcare uh, entities.
Mhm.
Um, we also don't have great interoperability.
Right.
Uh, it's improved a little bit, but not much. So that
Mhm.
if if someone's at University of Chicago on the south side of Chicago and is being treated there long term and has a very complex disease with, head imaging, MRIs, history of drugs and whatnot that are their persons on. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, there's an accident near Lake Michigan, and they end up in the emergency room at Northwestern. Even though Northwestern and Epic and Northwestern and University of Chicago have the same brand vendor of the electronic platform, uh, and although that the movement of information from one to the other has modestly improved, it's still really deficient. And it's almost like you're seeing a new patient then in that emergency room. And then layering on top of that, the fact that in the last half century, what has happened with disease burden in our country is we've gone from episodic, more acute illness to largely chronic illness. That $4.5 trillion, 90% of that is chewed up in chronic illness. And yet we have this siloed mentality without good continuity, which is not the way you would want to structure a healthcare system for a problem of chronic disease burden.
Right.
So when I look back on that paper, um, I see we talked about, the cost structure needed for heart transplants versus community-acquired pneumonias.
Yep.
But it was uncovering this bigger problem of the lack of continuity across our healthcare system in general.
Mhm. Mhm. And moving from the institution to another theme, 2 years later in the Journal of Academic Medicine, you publish a paper promoting an environment of professionalism. You talk about this, what's known as the University of Chicago roadmap at the time. And here again, looking at the new physicians that we're training, professionalism is something that is impacted beyond, okay, we can teach this clinician diagnostics and therapeutics and surgery and so forth, but there's all this other stuff that impacts someone's professionalism, the pharma rep in the hallway, the insurance company's issue with this specific payment, bedside manner, how you hand patients off to other institutes outside the hospital. Say a couple words about professionalism, if you would, and the University of Chicago roadmap.
Yeah, I think at a high level, the way you image professionalism is when the physician walks into the exam room with the patient. The physician's role there is a service role. The physician should be providing the patient the best possible care aligned with the patient's wishes and needs. And it should be sort of you're there to serve the patient, to understand the patient and interact with the patient. And there are all these minor things that can get in the way with that. So for example, I used to run and I had a knee problem and I went to my orthopedic surgeon there. and we had this great conversation. At the end, he wrote down on a tablet a couple of things I should do, ripped off the piece of paper and gave it to me. And I saw the logo and the top of the paper was a drug company's name. And one of the things that was recommended was a product from that company.
Right.
And I know that in that instance, these were things that were just being thrown around the clinics, and no attention was being paid to that. But for someone who didn't know that, you would say, "Gee, does this make sense that I'm being suggested to take this drug on a piece of paper that has the logo of this pharmaceutical firm on it?" And so the need for this penetrating professionalism, throughout medicine and throughout the training. And, one of the things that was learned is that the professionalism in the beginning of medical school can sometimes be at a higher level than at the end of medical school. The attitudes get shaped in the medical center where you can get aspects of professionalism beat out of you for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
What is that about? And having sort of a longitudinal view across those 4 years of training, professionalism, and identifying barriers that pop up, and the hidden curriculum that it's called in the medical school, where you lose track of what it is you're supposed to be as that servant that enters the exam room.
Right.
And there were several changes in medicine that were occurring around that time in education. Another one that you could detect at the time I was in the University of Chicago, not specifically University of Chicago, but throughout medical education, and has become, something that we worked on here extensively in the AMA, is competency.
Mm-hmm.
The medical students that we accepted were, just fabulous people with brilliant backgrounds. It was highly competitive. We had, I think, something like 85, 88 slots. We get 6,000 applicants. And you could interview 500 fantastic people, select 88 from that group and turn out pretty well. And it was I think the quality of the students and the quality of the faculty and the physicians led you to think that everything is good when you hadn't really proven that it was. You hadn't demonstrated competency. So when I was, it occurred to me when I was dean there on graduation day, I was very proud of these fabulous people that were being graduated from medical school. But if a board member had come up and asked me, could I prove with evidence that each of these students has demonstrated competencies in the diagnosis and management of the 10 most common diseases in the United States? My answer would have been, I'm almost certain that's true, but I can't show you the evidence. So, demonstrating, getting a more competency-based curriculum rather than a time and chair curriculum was really important, something we've worked on here. Another big change is there was a time in medicine, probably when I was in medical school, where you could cram everything in, but the amount of evidence and data now are so great that no one human being can do that. So how do you go about lifelong learning, and how do you go about data analytics and learning in real time? And there are, various things that I think will unspool from that effort. One I'll mention here is a product that is emerging from our work, calling it Reconnect,
Yep.
that uses an AI platform to go into the electronic health record and fish out the panel, say 1,200 patients that this physician sees. And so the tool will know what it is that physician sees. Then it will look out on the physician's calendar for the next 2 weeks and see what of those patients are returning. And from that, be able to create a bespoke educational program for what that physician is actually going to encounter in the next weeks. As you know, and these guides are going to be more and more important as you know disease and treatment and diagnosis gets more and more complex.
No, that's a perfect segue into where we're headed, especially with the one of the strategic arcs that you've been involved in creating at AMA in terms of medical education consortium. Um, Talk just for a couple. I mean, we have the AMA, and just for our audience, a little trivia. It founded here in Philadelphia, 1847. For its first 50 years or so, you basically existed as the FDA before the FDA existed, sort of, involved in all aspects of the patent medicine era and keeping odd remedies out of the market till we got the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906 and the FDA was formed. Obviously, the mission evolves. Current mission promoting the art and science of medicine and the betterment of public health. Um, Jim, talk about because you arrived in 2011 and key to what you've been up to, and you talked about this in your recent I guess the annual meeting or this the three strategic arcs, and we'll be going into them, creating a focus on medical education and unique technologies and innovation to enhance it, health equity, and then of course the innovation studio per Health 2047. Say a couple words just about why you joined AMA at leadership, and then we'll get into the strategic arcs.
Yeah, well, after leaving University of Chicago, stepping away at least from the CEO dean job, I did a little bit of a walkabout for almost 18 months to learn some things about medicine that you don't tend to get exposed to in academic medical centers. So, venture, private equity,
Yep.
How these engines of creativity affect medicine. And at this time, I also got a call from a search firm looking for the next leader here at the AMA. And to tell you the truth, I didn't know a lot about the AMA except I was a member. I was a member for purposes, I would say, sort of vague solidarity. Uh, I knew that it was an iconic organization. I didn't know the total history of it. And of course, I got JAMA, as JAMA, New England Journal, and then my
Sure.
specialty journals, so I could keep up to date. And the search committee indicated that they were not happy with the way the strategy was done, and I had always been interested in strategy. And so I thought I would look, and I didn't completely understand it, but I realized it had what's called the House of Delegates, where they assemble twice a year all the medical societies, representatives of all the medical societies. So we have 190 medical societies, all 50 states, the
Mhm.
territories, all specialty societies, the 4 branches of military medicine, all in one room, debating policy and then voting democratically as to what's going to be the AMA policy. And what was, I think, a problem perceived that seemed to be a false problem at the end of the day was if you're going to have this body make your policy twice a year, how is it you can have a long-term strategic view um, if you're going to have policies generated twice a year? And the answer to me was when you looked at that policy portfolio, you saw that there were meta signals. There were broad themes under which there might be 50, 60 policies. And that broad theme is not going to go away. So it was picking out these meta signals that allowed for a sort of a longer term strategy vision to be pursued. And as you indicated, those three things that we initially identified were the educational domain, changing medical education for the 21st, not the 20th century, dealing with chronic disease better than we're doing it now because it chews up that $4.5 trillion that the nation spends. And we've had this shift in burden in the last half century to more chronicity. And then lastly, getting rid of the impediments of physicians interacting with patients. That, I have to say, was a clear theme. But when we dug into it, I was a little surprised at what was under it. So we started with some research, and the research showed that it turns out that if you measure what incentivizes physicians and what satisfies them, it comes down to one thing: it's time with patients.
Mm.
And if you look at what are the dissatisfiers, it's a myriad of things that get in the way of spending time with a patient. So if that was a satisfier, our next set of experiments, research, was okay, if the satisfier is spending time with patients, how much time do physicians spend with patients during their day?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer, which was shocking to me at the time, was for every hour a physician spends face-to-face with a patient, they spend 2 hours doing administrative work, including data entry on computers. And then that doesn't also account for something that was also recognized and that was referred to as pajama time, where on average, an hour and a half, 2 hours a night, people spend on their computers, getting the data entry complete. And so that, says a lot about the burnout physicians have as well. They came into the profession to be interacting with patients, not to be expensive data entry clerks.
Right.
And so how one thinks about that is also an important part of the AMA's work. And it unfortunately has multiple pieces. So it has this administrative piece coming to you. It has, the computer interaction piece. It has the decision support piece, that simplifies your thinking and your ability to probe in deeply into literature, immediately given a case in front of you. And then it has the piece about how you order your time in the clinic throughout the day. So all these pieces have multiple sub-pieces to them that should be simplified, but we end up wasting a half to 2/3 of this very expensive workforce that is incredibly highly trained. So that was the problem there. The problem with chronic disease was we're still set up for episodic, and yet our burden is chronic. And the problem with education are some of the things we mentioned, to be competency based.
Right.
Another area in the educational domain that became recognized is if you go around the country to different medical schools and you talk to medical students, in general, they all love their schools and they're, very supportive of their schools. But if you really push them as to what's missing, you come up with two things repeatedly. And that is they don't really understand healthcare policy, how it's made and what it means to them and their careers. And secondly, they don't understand the financial wiring of the healthcare system. And so we've created this, beside clinical education and research, basic science education, we created this third stool of the education platform for medical schools, health system science, where these things are identified, data analytics, health equity, all of these important elements that are otherwise missing from the experience.
Right. Let's drill down on a couple of those because there's a lot of things there that you unpacked, and I just like to highlight. Well, they're all quite interesting, but a couple that stood out to me. In the sort of the strategic arc of medical education, you have this reimagining residency program, or it's a grant program, and you've been doling out grants for there's and we'll put the link, obviously the AMA website, at Montefiore, studying social determinants of health, at Hopkins and Stanford, looking at burnout, as you were talking about. It's the one at Mass Gen and Brigham and Women's, where you have the program called Promotion in Place. And this is what I'm sort of getting back to in terms of competency and, how, I guess it sort of resonated with me, like, with the whole thing of like, why is everybody in, the 11th grade the same age? There's a really smart kid in the corner there that accelerates 2 years ahead of me. Okay. And it seems like, okay, medical school, if there's someone that's, hey, really good at whatever, heart surgery, that they're pretty good at heart surgery, we should probably move them along a little faster or through different promotion channels and so all that. Say a couple words about Promotion in Place and what's happening at Mass Gen, if you would.
Well, so it's at Mass General and also other places that both in the residency programs on one hand, and medical school on the other, and it's all around sort of the measured competencies.
Yeah.
And one of the medical schools, I think about a third of the class now graduate a year early. And that creates a coordination issue that you have to take care of in terms of sequencing of training. But, why not graduate if you're ready to graduate and you
Right.
have the demonstrated competencies? Something that's an extension of what we're talking about now that is new thinking here, is precision education.
Okay.
So that if you have these competencies, whether it be medical school or residency, and you can be promoted in place, so to speak, what one finds is that everyone is different. You can have someone who is on the line for increasing their educational experience and measuring, hitting this competency, then that competency, and that competency, and you see the first 2 years, and you say, "Boy, this fellow's a rock star, not going to have any problems at all."
Yeah.
And then in a fourth year, or maybe the first year of residency, they fall off. They fall off that curve a little bit. And you have to mitigate and jump on that right away. So the, personalized and precision kinds of education, I think, will be deployed for these purposes in the future, and can be deployed in an in and out way. But it's, the secret sauce of the whole thing is thinking about education in a competency-based way,
Right.
rather than the time in chair.
Right. Yeah, no, it was just again, it was quite interesting seeing that. And at first, it was like, oh, okay, this seems kind of obvious, but yeah, it's nice to see that there's actually programs that you're funding to allow that to happen more expeditiously. So that's great. Um, Yeah, I get you. You mentioned, your time you spent sort of in venture and investment banking and checking out that whole domain, and you set up Health 2047, which sort of at the epicenter of all things venture capital in Menlo Park. I see with a productivity component, but this chronic disease component. You mentioned some of the tools, and again, we'll put the link to the website in terms of the portfolio, things like this company Avidium, which you mentioned, sort of the AI productivity based stuff. I mean, if you would, one of the things was this company Phenomics. It was in the portfolio talking about sort of the phenotyping of obesity, clearly in this current age of GLP-1 products and all things Ozempic and so forth. Very hot topic. We don't normally think about how, one person's obesity might be quite different genetically and so forth than one another. I was wondering if you could say a couple words about this, because this is a very interesting connection, obviously, because so many chronic diseases hit back at sort of the metabolic side of things. Say a couple words about that if you would, then other parts of the portfolio that you're quite excited about.
So the origin of this was, there were some things we wanted to do that we just didn't have the internal capabilities of doing. And we could do a lot here in the central building in Chicago, but not everything. And what sort of the venture type work that needed to be done for some of the extensions, we just didn't have, I think, the structures here to do that. And so a friend of mine was in this area and was stepping away from his third fund and was looking for something exciting to do. And they taught entrepreneurship at a couple of the business schools. And I said, well, one of the things that would be fun to do is spend a third of your time for a year in our building from a venture point of view and see what you think. And, there are different ways of thinking about the problems that we're addressing. And he thought there was. And so then became how do we do this? And I looked at some of the innovation studios, and I think some of the ones that had flaws that I worried about potentially, and some of the flaws were in the following domains. That if you were in an institution and you had an innovation studio, often the problem that you would define would be a problem with a small p, not a big P. It would be kind of unique and sculpted to your situation, which means that if you got a solution to that, the solution might be bespoke for your organization. The other aspect, when you talk with folks at such centers, is that no matter how an institution, large, iconic institution that's been present for many years, no matter how much they love their innovation studio, they can't stop themselves from squashing it with bureaucracy, whether that be, HR, hiring, payroll, you name it. And I ran across a fellow that had done the operating plan for In-Q-Tel for the Central Intelligence Agency in the late 90s. And that seemed net to be something that worked well and was interesting. And so we copied that homework essentially and created a wholly owned but independently operating innovation studio that was for-profit in Silicon Valley. And the way one can think of this is if you take the strategic framework of the AMA, the commercial translation of that are the strategic pillars of Health 2047. So you have that kind of alignment. And then, so you have things like chronic disease, one of the three arcs. Well, one of those diseases defined as a disease by the House of Delegates a few years ago is obesity. And it is exploding. And we, identified co-founders of this company that was brought into Health 2047 for development that co-founders originally came from the Mayo Clinic. Michael Camarelli was a very important one. Andre Acosta, another brilliant guys in this field. And we worked through data, they worked through data with their teams to show that you could divide the phenotypes of obesity into 4 different classes with some overlap, but 4 different classes. And the approach therapeutically to each of these was different. Some of those responded to the GLP-1s, others did not. And so if you could phenotype someone who was not going to be a responder, why would you want to have that person on a drug that costs $1,500 a month? And then they weren't going to respond and, have to deal with the side effects as well. So that was the basis for phenomics. And they have now reduced this to a genetic test of, I think something like a few hundred SNPs that you can take a cheek swab, take the kit, and see what phenotype you are. And then you can, get on the appropriate therapy. And I have to say that the company benefited from the fact that it became their diagnostic tool became mature just at a time when the GLP-1s exploded.
Yep.
Um,
Oh,
and
yeah.
it'll be actually they'll be presented. My daughter does our daughter does programming for New York Bio
Okay.
and has one this coming Monday, and Phenomics is going to be part of that program at the New York Stock Exchange. Uh,
Nice. Nice.
so that was, Avidium is another company that's AI driven. It's referenced AI, so it creates knowledge graphs of medical knowledge uh, and relates, one piece of knowledge to another concept, and then you can see these relationships between these pieces of knowledge. Uh, it is AI driven so that it's updated continually based on what is in the literature. And you can see through to the primary literature, if there's an expert in some area and they want to, they get the evidence from Evidium and say, yeah, but I want to know what the basis of this recommendation is. You can see through to the original paper, the original graph.
Nice.
Um, so it's a reference-based AI tool that will help be a potentially a platform that many things can layer onto that relate to, update and guidance and decision support
Mhm.
for physicians. That's going to be important as well.
Excellent. And while we have the AI and while we have now these tools to make personalized medicine more specific, more precision, we also need a wide swath of patients, and this I guess feeds nicely into what's going on in the health equity front and your programs there at AMA. And there was actually this was just yesterday. You came out with this article, long-term commitment needed for more inclusive clinical trials, and you're quoted in this talking about uh, sort of the FDA's recent guidance on the topic, but could you just say a couple words? I mean, I know inclusive clinical trials is one part of sort of the umbrella of health equity initiatives at AMA, but if you could just say a couple words about this as well, because I think it's important that
Yeah.
for all these tools that we have and all the cool stuff you're doing in Health 2047, that we have to have a wide range of patients feeding into that data.
Yeah. So I would start by saying that the three strategic arcs, each of them also are powered by a small number of accelerators that we call accelerators.
Yep.
And one is health equity, and another is innovation that relates to the Health 2047 discussion we had,
Yep.
some of the things that we were doing internally.
Yep.
Um, with health equity, we have populations that are underserved and under-resourced and have worse outcomes than others. And if we think of, our aspirations in chronic disease, medical education, and getting patients more effectively interacting with physicians, all three of those have an artificial glass ceiling if we don't take care of the equity problem
Yeah.
and don't level that playing field somewhat. And, that has been recognized that the NIH and the FDA that now require, different patients to have a representative population in clinical trials in terms of race, ethnicity, geography, and whatnot. It turns out that's hard to get
Yeah.
at an academic medical center, harder than you would imagine. And, we heard from Francis Collins when he was director of NIH, isn't there a way of physicians that are in practice, even small practices, participating in clinical trials?
Hmm.
The answer is no, because the cost of getting on top of that and getting the infrastructure for clinical trials is too high. Um, And so we've worked recently, and this was also work done at Health 2047, uh, with a group to launch a company, SiteBridge. And SiteBridge can reduce the clinical trial to a trial in a box
Nice.
so that even small practices can participate in clinical trials. And there are now contracts written with two large pharmaceutical firms. And the early experience is that the recruitment of patients has actually been really fabulous under SiteBridge. And SiteBridge brings the diversity of populations that one needs to these clinical trials. So that's, one method of beginning to make sure that when we do trials in patient populations, that those populations are actually representative of the US population as opposed to some subsegment that's specialized in the population.
Mm.
And this gets to another point as well. It's really widely quoted and, talked about all the time in the uh, uh, both the OECD national database for how those OECD nations compete on the healthcare front. A recent Commonwealth Fund study also come to the same conclusion that we in the United States have we spend a lot of money and we don't get the juice out of that in terms of the outcome, the improved outcomes. Um, I would say it's simultaneously true that if you look at the OECD data, whereas we're, as a country, most expensive, we're also dead last in safety net support,
Mm.
uh, across the country for those that are marginalized, disinvested in. We're probably, in my view, we're probably never going to have a single payer like the UK does. And I say that because that seems to me not in the nature of our nation. Um, you know, everyone thinks of themselves as sort of like this rough individualist in the West on top of a horse or some such thing. And this is just the nature of our country. So we're going to have to get around this in other ways. And, we're going to have to deal straight on with this health inequity issue.
Yeah, most definitely. And I appreciate bringing up SiteBridge. We'll put the link to, that's a very interesting organization, and it sort of fits in nicely with this whole principle that we've been hearing about in terms of the distributed clinical trials and, the clinical trial recruitment at local pharmacies and so forth. So no, that's another really interesting investment in the portfolio. Um, can you a couple months ago, I noticed that you took part in a panel at a conference. It was called Truth in Medicine, and you were on a panel entitled Misinformation, Finding Signal in the Noise, and sort of the sub-theme of the conference was health and longevity science. Um, you know, again, I'm sitting here in Philly, sort of the early epicenter of all things vaccine. I never thought, in 2024 we'd see such uh, misinformation, whether it's about vaccines, whether it's about seed oils or high fructose corn syrup or whatever the thing may be. But there's a lot of noise out right now, and I'd love for you, one, if you could just talk a little bit about the AMA's role, the AMA's members' role in sort of combating this called sort of pseudo pandemic of health misinformation that's upon us, and then as the theme, was health and longevity, so this area of aging and longevity, health span biosciences has been kind of hot. Would love to just get your top line on it as the CEO of the AMA, and sort of what your members currently think about it, because it is a burgeoning area. I mean, aging is connected to quite a few of those chronic degenerative diseases that we chatted about before, and
Right.
would love to get your perspective on that as well.
Yeah. So I had mixed feelings about being asked to participate on a panel titled the Misinformation Panel. Uh, joking aside, though, I think that we being, you know, biomedicine broadly, also have some ownership here of some of the things that we created by inadvertent shortening of our explanations in language. So, for example, there had never been a vaccine uh, developed and deployed effectively during a, large-scale infective outbreak that had taken less than about 6 years. And so in the beginning, say, well, there were new platforms coming on, the mRNA platforms, from early work in Ebola and some other diseases.
Yep.
And maybe we could use those, but, it's been a long time since it takes a long time to develop a vaccine. We probably could have spoken a little more about, the potential of platforms that are new. Probably a larger miss in our language was not saying where we were in the knowledge base buildup around the pandemic. So we would say, the best advice and evidence we can give based on evidence so far is to wear a mask, not wear a mask, do this, do that. What we didn't say, we didn't add some language to that to say, this is a novel, unknown circumstance. And we have very limited data currently and very limited understanding. The best interpretation that we do have currently would recommend this, but that could change tomorrow based on the flux of information that's coming in a rich way in this unknown circumstance. So we didn't paint the full picture of, where we were. And so what folks heard were, well, the recommendation this month is different than last month. What are we supposed to do? I think to some degree, the question about lockdowns and how long they should go also suffered a bit from looking at it strictly from a public health, infectious disease point of view, and to some degree ignoring some of the social science that showed the potential vulnerability, and then tying that into, this unknown, the unknown that we have. So I think we muddled through this, and people talk about, the social networks of misinformation, and that's all true and it's amplifying. But I think we own some of this ourselves, as we could have been more precise and thorough in our language. In terms of the longevity, I'm becoming really, have to say, more and more interested in longevity and the science around that. In 2012, there was a Nobel given out to a fellow, Yamamaka, I believe is the pronunciation. Yep. And he identified factors that could be applied to a mature cell that had differentiated and make that cell go back into a pluripotential state. These were rated, later recognized to be transcription factors that regulate methylation of DNA, that target, if you put these transcription factors in a cell and overexpress them, there'll be broad demethylation of DNA. And methylation of DNA is, and particular sites in the DNA, is known as a aging clock. Yet there are some things about that aging clock. A young couple, both of the age of 30, can have a methylation clock suggesting they're age 30. But when they have a child, the methylation clock of that child is 0, which suggests that this is reversible. There are some experiments done, and there was one done, I think, the second year of the pandemic. It was on the cover of Nature, of age-related blindness in mice. as a model where the factors were put into the optic nerve or retina and sight was restored. Um, there is evidence now that if you look at various aging clocks, whether it be, you know, proteins released from organs into the serum as one marker, or, methylation of DNA is another clock, that if you have a chronic disease of the metabolic system or the cardiovascular system, that your system may be aging more quickly than other organ systems, which has the benefit of potentially tying together in a logical concept aging across multiple chronic diseases.
Yep.
So, and people are now, talking about health span rather than lifespan. How one maintains health of organ systems as long as possible, and so you're healthy until late in life. So I think the concept of aging and the experiments that are being done around aging, the learnings that are being done scientifically, are going to be of fabulous impact to our understanding of medicine in the next 50 years.
Excellent. Let's talk about the next year. You've been in this role, leading the organization, maturing all these programs, these strategic arcs. Tell us what's happened in 2025, Jim.
Well, we're going to, there's been an election. There'll be new leadership in many of the agencies, CMS, HHS, FDA. There's some of the folks that have been nominated. Well, first of all, they have to be approved, and we have to see what they say during their time in the Senate, between Senate panels, to give us an idea what they're thinking. We have a very broad agenda. We're nonpartisan, we're bipartisan. And, once we figure out what people want to work on, how they're going to attack their programs, we can see what part of our agenda aligned with that and, try to make hay there. We will keep up our work in those three areas of chronic disease education and protecting physicians' time, and continue to develop our companies that are the commercial translation of those solutions in Health 2047, and look forward to working with the new administration, any new administration, to try to improve the health of our nation. We're going to keep our eye on that ball.
Excellent. Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting time, and as you were mentioning with the what's happening at all those agencies, yeah, will be a very interesting 2025. And again, it's been so exciting, talking to you and not just going through your journey, but just seeing the connection again in this mission of bettering public health, and then the connection to innovation, which is obviously extremely key for our audience. Really, really awesome work, Jim. And I just again take my hat off to you and wish you the best with all these programs as we head into the new year with the new administration. Again, for everybody that's going to be joining us on the show, listening across the podcast networks or watching on our YouTube channel. Again, you've been spending time with Dr. James Madara, Chief Executive Officer, Executive Vice President of the American Medical Association, doing really amazing things to execute on their mission to promote the art and science of medicine, all for the betterment of public health. Jim, again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to us today for a little while about what you've been up to. Obviously, thank you for everything you do. And as we like to say on our show, thanks for creating a better tomorrow via what you do for public health and everyone out there. Really an awesome story, and just wish you the best for 2025.
Thanks for the privilege of doing this, Ira. It's been fun. Really enjoyed it.
Great having you.